The logic of sovereign spending and the nature of taxation. 1. Government spending precedes tax collection. A foundational principle of modern monetary systems is that sovereign governments must spend currency into existence before that currency can be used by the public to pay taxes. Since taxpayers cannot pay with dollars unless they first acquire them, and the original source of those dollars is government issuance, it follows that federal spending logically precedes taxation. Thus, taxation functions not as a funding mechanism but as a tool to create demand for the currency and manage aggregate demand. Footnote: This section explains that the collection of taxes depends on the prior existence of government-issued currency, making government spending a prerequisite to taxation. 2. Taxes do not finance government spending. Although it appears that taxes fund public expenditures, the opposite is true in a sovereign fiat system. Currency used for taxation originated from prior government disbursements. Once in circulation, taxes may reduce the money supply, but they do not provide operational funding. Governments like the United States, which issue their own currency, are not constrained by revenue in the same way households or businesses are. Their ability to spend is limited by real resources, not financial inputs. Footnote: This section clarifies that in a fiat currency regime, taxes function to regulate currency circulation and demand, not to fund spending. 3. Currency issuing sovereigns cannot be revenue constrained. A sovereign that issues its own currency, such as the United States, cannot run out of it. This is because such governments create money as they spend. The analogy is drawn to an individual writing IOUs. One would not need to borrow one's own IOU back to issue another. Similarly, the U.S. government does not need to borrow its own currency before spending. This reality invalidates the assumption that deficits represent fiscal irresponsibility or insolvency risk. Footnote: This section asserts that governments issuing their own currency are not subject to revenue constraints and can always meet obligations denominated in their own money. 4. Borrowing in foreign currency imposes real constraints. While sovereign borrowing in domestic currency poses no solvency risk, borrowing in foreign currency does. Obligations denominated in foreign currency must be repaid in that currency, limiting domestic policy flexibility. It introduces exchange rate exposure and requires the government to secure foreign reserves, effectively reducing its autonomy. Such arrangements are akin to adopting a fixed exchange rate regime and can compromise fiscal sovereignty. Footnote: This section outlines why borrowing in foreign currency creates constraints on a sovereign government's domestic policy options and introduces solvency risk. 5. Inflation is the real constraint, not insolvency. For currency issuing governments, the true constraint on spending is inflation, not bankruptcy. Excessive spending can overheat the economy, causing prices to rise. However, insolvency is structurally impossible because the government can always issue more currency. As such, policy debates should focus on managing inflationary pressures and resource allocation rather than balancing budgets or fearing deficits. Footnote: This section differentiates between real and nominal constraints, emphasizing that inflation, not insolvency, limits sovereign spending. 6. Sovereign currency and the absence of solvency risk. There is no solvency risk for a government that issues its own currency. Public narratives asserting the possibility of government bankruptcy, such as those expressed during certain administrations, reflect a fundamental misunderstanding of sovereign monetary operations. Budget deficits do not signal impending default, they simply denote that more currency has been spent into the economy than has been taxed out. Footnote: This section rejects the notion of sovereign insolvency and reiterates that budget deficits reflect fiscal injections, not financial distress. 7. The life cycle of a negotiable instrument, issuance. The legal life of a negotiable instrument begins with issuance, defined under Article 3 of the Uniform Commercial Code, UCC, Section 3 to 105 is the first delivery of the instrument by its maker, in the case of a note, or drawer, in the case of a check, for the purpose of giving the recipient rights to the instrument. This initial act of creation and delivery is not merely physical but legal, as it vests the payee with enforceable rights under the instrument. Footnote: this section defines issuance as the first legal and physical delivery of a negotiable instrument, creating initial rights for the payee. 8. Transfers between issuance and presentment. Once issued, a negotiable instrument may undergo multiple transfers before it reaches its final stage, presentment. Each transfer signifies a legally significant movement of the instrument. While all negotiations are transfers, not all transfers constitute negotiations. A transfer merely requires delivery with the intent to give the recipient rights in the instrument. However, whether the transferee becomes a holder, a legal term of art, depends on whether the transfer qualifies as a negotiation under UCC 3-201 and 3-203. Footnote: this section distinguishes between transfers and negotiations, noting that only some transfers elevate the recipient to the legal status of a holder. 9. Presentment, the final demand for payment. Presentment refers to the formal request for payment made to the party obligated to pay under the instrument, typically the maker, in the case of a note, or the drawee bank, in the case of a check. Presentment is governed by UCC 3-501 and is a critical legal act that triggers the payment obligation. Until presentment occurs, the instrument remains in a state of potential enforceability. Failure to present in a timely manner may affect certain rights, such as the enforcement of secondary liability. Footnote: this section defines presentment as the formal act of demanding payment under a negotiable instrument, governed by UCC 3-501.